few items of just housekeeping that we're going to take care of first, and then we will do the request for the bill draft introductions. The first thing we're going to do is we had 3 members that were not here when we last met. And so we do need to hear from you 3. We'll begin with you, Representative Barth. And are you ready for this, the questioning? No, so we just please introduce yourself, where you're from, that kind of thing, maybe how long you've been in the legislature. And then tell us one either movie, series, it could be a book that is centered about something legal that you either relate to or that you've loved watching, something that you've learned from. But what is some piece of entertainment for you that has to do with the legal profession? So go ahead.
So Representative Carrie Barth from Baldwin City, which is House District 5. So that's Douglas County, and I have portions of Douglas, Johnson, Miami, and Franklin County. I've been here, this has been the 3rd session, so first time I've been reelected. And oh my gosh, legal movies, TV shows. I don't know, I think like I cried during Air Force One, the movie. Isn't that what's called, Air Force One, the movie? Yeah, my husband thinks that's super weird, but I did.
Was that okay? Y'all help me. Was that legal? Was that something?
It's presidentially related.
Okay, it is a movie, so okay.
It's the only one I can think of off the top of my head when we put on the spot first.
Hey, I know. Sorry to put you on the spot, but okay. Now, Representative Lewis, you were one of the 3 not here, is that correct?
I was.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Apologize.
That's okay.
This is mine.
Okay, go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
So my name's Bob Lewis. I'm from Garden City. I'm an attorney. And I guess I'll say Paper Chase, which probably only the older folks in the audience will remember, but it's about a law student, first year and he was, it was sort of about his relationship with his contracts professor, Kingsfield, as I understand the member. And it happened that he also was dating his daughter. And, right, John? Which created problems.
Yeah.
The professor's daughter.
Right.
And excuse me? Close to it, yeah. So anyhow, fast forward to my law experience, my law school experience, and I was not the subject of it, but in my contracts class, and the professor she was like this very diminutive woman who looked like she was 25. It was quite a contrast from, the old gray-haired, but she called on a colleague of mine, and in the same case, I think that Kingsfield had queried the protagonist in Paper Chase. And when what happened in the movie, as I recall, was Kingsfield was not impressed with the answers that the protagonist gave, and he said, Mr. So-and-so, I can't recall his name. John, do you remember?
It's coming to me, but I'm thinking of the carbolic smoke ball case, but I'm not sure.
Okay, well, anyhow, but he said, Mr. So-and-so, here's a dime. You can call your mother and tell her that you no longer intend to be a lawyer. And in my law school experience, the professor said, here's a quarter. You can call your mother and tell her that you do intend to be a lawyer. That wasn't me. That was a colleague. So.
Oh, that's good.
So.
Okay, thank you for that explanation. That was interesting. And nobody said the Paper Chase when we were in the big committee. So I appreciate that. Thank you. And wasn't it plastics? It's about plastics that he's supposed to get into. So. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Be thinking, Representative Barth, we can come back to you if something else comes to mind. But I'm gonna go over to Representative Goddard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Dan Goddard. I represent the 7th District. My district borders the largest unfenced penitentiary in the world, commonly referred to as Oklahoma. No, it's most of Labette County in southeast Kansas, the western part of Neosho County, and for some reason, I only have 60% of Chanute. So, but anyway, the redistricting made a big difference. This is my 3rd year on this committee. I'm not an attorney, but I've enjoyed every minute of it. It's my, let's see, my 7th year in the legislature. But I do have some experience with law. I was in the military for 24 years. I've sat on a court-martial panel. I've administered Article 15s, which are a form of punishment. And I am an advocate or a follower of Law and Order series on TV and Law and Order Special Victims Unit. I think they're really cool. Of course, they're all about real life. So,
Of course. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, thank you for that. Did you tell us where your district was, Representative Lewis? You
I
did?
think so. I was
did say
jumping
Garden.
to the chase.
Right.
Garden City, the
Okay.
123rd District.
Okay.
And this is my 2nd term.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Representative Barth, any addition? Sorry, I don't mean to. Okay, no problem. All right, the other thing we're going to do really quickly is just take a look at the rules. You have them in front of you. We're going to adopt the committee house rules. Really, nothing much has changed from previous years. The only thing that is a little bit different is that during COVID, we did say that you could vote if you were in the building. You could vote, but that's no longer true. So now that's rule number 21. So all votes will be taken in the committee room, just so you know that that's that. I do want to just mention rule number 17, which is granting excused absences. Pretty much most everything will be excused. I would like you to let me know ahead of time, though, if you're not going to be here. So that would be just that. And then, the other is just the way we have set up, or the way the Kansas legislature works, it's a very strong chair process. And just so you know that, as far as scheduling, limiting testimony, all that kind of thing, that is up to the chair. I want to give everyone as much time as possible, but this session, we're condensing things a little bit. And so we may have to have some more abbreviated hearings, and we may have to limit some testimony and that kind of thing. So just know that that might be something that comes up. So I will be as fair as possible with all of that. Does anyone have any questions about that? Yes, Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would it be possible for me to trade in my extra copy of Chief Justice's testimony for the rules?
Yes. Our
Thank you.
committee, yes, there you go. Thank you. Okay, any other questions on that? Any other questions on the rules? Okay, then the rules are adopted just as they are in that case. Okay, now we're just going to go to committee members. Does anyone have any request for committee sponsor bill drafts for introduction? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have RS 0168, which is a bill allowing for child support to be sought for pregnancy costs.
Okay, are there any objections? Without objection, that bill will be introduced, requested to be introduced. Okay, anyone else on the committee have any other requests? Okay, anyone in the audience have a request for bill introduction? Representative Past. Patton, I can't call you anything but
Yeah,
that.
just call me Fred.
Chair.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Fred Patton. I'm here on behalf of Charter Communications to request RS 0189. It makes changes to what is defined as a critical infrastructure facility in KSA 215818.
Okay, are there any objections? Without objection, then that will be requested to be introduced.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, anyone else? Miss Strauss, come on up. Okay, just pull it on.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm Nancy Strauss. I'm here on behalf of the Judicial Council to request RS 0307, and it contains 2 acts from the Uniform Law Commission relating to guardianship.
Okay, committee, any objections to this one? Okay, without objection, that will be requested to be introduced. Thank you. Okay, anyone else have any request in the audience? Okay, then I think we'll move on to the next thing on the agenda. We are very honored today to have our Chief Justice here to speak with us about the Kansas Rural Justice Initiative report. So, Justice Lukert, are you here? Yes. And we do have, we all got some information about that. So, yes, welcome to committee. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. Yep.
Sorry, it was not on. I apologize. Start over, Chief Justice Marla Lukert. If I may, I would like to turn over to Justice Wall to present the report and the recommendations to you. And then if it serves the committee's timeline, would be happy to come back up to answer any questions about that topic or any other topics, and also hit maybe a few other points if you would like to hear some other updates. So.
Okay, thank you. That would be great. Thank you for staying because maybe we will have some questions. That would be great. So Justice Wall, please come up. We really thank you for being here at the House Judiciary Committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and other fellow members of the committee. I am really honored to have served as the chair of our Rural Justice Initiative Committee. Our committee has finalized its initial work in publicizing a report, and we are going to summarize key findings and recommendations for you today. I ask you to bear with me. There's a lot of information, and if I may ask, Madam Chair, if the committee has other agenda items, I want to be sure I'm respectful of the committee's time in terms of the presentation.
We just have, so I think after you, Chief Justice Lukert may have some comments for us. Then that's all that we have on the agenda for the day.
All right, well, I don't want to keep you all night by any means, but we're
doing great. Thank you.
Great. We'll get started. We'll get underway. Not sure where I need to point this clicker to turn it. This is. That's great. You can try it again. Okay, great. Excellent. Thank you. For those that may not be aware, just to give you a little bit of a roadmap, I thought I would give a little bit of background about why this committee even exists and how it was designed and formulated before we move on and talk about the work that committee did, the findings that it uncovered, and then the recommendations that the committee has made to try and address what we've identified as a critical shortage of attorneys in our state. And that includes primarily rural Kansas, but we see that this isn't going to, in too long of a time, start impacting our urban areas as well. So this all started off December 1st of 2022 when Chief Justice Lukert entered an administrative order creating the Rural Justice Initiative Committee. Now, behind the scenes, the reason that we took this action, or why the Chief Justice implemented this order, is we kept hearing reports with increasing frequency from our rural judges and rural attorneys. The judges, particularly chief judges, were telling us that they were having real struggles finding counsel to appoint to cases where the right to counsel is guaranteed by the Constitution. And our attorneys were
particularly some attorneys that have been practicing in successful law practices for decades, saying that they're looking to turn their practice over to a newer attorney, and they just couldn't find anybody to take that over. And they weren't going to just retire and not provide services to the community. And I'm not talking about they couldn't find anybody to purchase their practice. They were just trying to find somebody to step in and just take it over. So as we continued to hear those reports, we knew we had a problem. We just didn't really know how to measure that problem and what was contributing to that. And that really became the task of this committee. So the chief, I think, was very thoughtful, intentional in how she put this committee together. We certainly wanted to have individuals from various perspectives and backgrounds, but all of whom had a vested interest in our rural communities. So we knew we were going to be starting at least with chief judges, district court judges, and magistrate judges in rural parts and rural districts in our state. So you can see the list of those that participated on our committee in the handout materials. But we also knew that we needed all branches of government as well. We had Senator Bowers, who was a very committed and active participant, along with, at the time, Representative Blue from District 112 out in the Great Bend area, now Senator Blue, of course. And then we brought in a representative from the Office of Rural Prosperity, thinking that they would have some expertise on rural economics and rural businesses in particular. That way we had at least input and perspectives from all three branches. Beyond that, we also included representatives from our law schools and undergraduate institutions as well, because when there's a demand problem in terms of a number of attorneys, you want to see what's going on the supply side as well. And for us, that's our law schools. And then we wanted other leading organizations that understood the rural economy and also just had demonstrated a commitment to rural communities across the state. That's where you see several of the members identified here, representing organizations like the Kansas Chamber, Kansas Farm Bureau, and others. And last, but certainly not least, we needed to, have the perspective of those on the front lines, our practicing attorneys in rural communities. Those both that have been practicing for decades and understood how the situation had changed over time, and newer attorneys that had decided to buck a trend and not practice in an urban or a large law firm and practice in a rural setting. So the committee was really diverse and I think thoughtfully created so that we could have a really sound understanding of all the dynamics. And one of the first things that the committee had to address is the question of what is rural. And I just wanted to mention that before we talk about the work that the committee performed. It's almost though I'm holding you in suspense, but that PowerPoint slide actually had the definition in that slide. But what we did is we used a definition the legislature has already used in similar program models. And we defined rural to exclude the 5 most populous counties in our state, Johnson, Sedgwick, Douglas, Shawnee, and Wyandotte counties, right? Even though they don't fit the definition of rural, as I mentioned, and as our statistics will show, this problem is already becoming visible in our urban centers as well. It's just certainly more pronounced in rural Kansas. But that's the definition we used because the legislature had used it before, and we thought it really did reflect the rural character of our state and the difficulty that all of these 100 counties have. They share a commonality in that they have these struggles recruiting and retaining attorneys to their communities. Well, there it is. So what did the committee do? I think because it was so thoughtfully put together, The committee was really committed and devoted to the work and sacrificed a lot of their time. And I really appreciate all their work. But we started by examining the data that already existed, census data, demographic information, our current attorney registration data that we have on the judicial branch. And largely that helped us identify where we had gaps in information and data that needed to be filled in. So the next step the committee took was to put together a survey, and we conducted that survey statewide among all attorneys in our rural counties across all 100 counties across the state. And we got a statistically significant response and gathered some very helpful information from that survey. We also did listening tours in different communities from Great Bend to Dodge City to Pittsburgh, Kansas. We did focus group interviews with law students at both Washburn University and University of Kansas School of Law, collaborated with other universities and university-affiliated groups to help us refine this data so it was reliable, help us do some GIS mapping. And at all of our meetings, we were bringing in guest speakers that were primarily directors of other programs in our state and beyond that were operating programs designed to recruit and retain licensed professionals in their communities. It wasn't always in the legal profession. Sometimes it was a physician program. Sometimes, for example, the Kansas State University Rural Veterinary Program is another example of folks that we brought in to try and identify what was working for those professions and maybe what didn't work initially that they had to adjust over time, so we could also formulate our recommendations accordingly. Okay, so that's the work that we did. So what did we learn? Really, we learned there's a shortage of attorneys statewide, right? As I mentioned, but it's certainly more pronounced in our rural communities across the state. The graph that we have up right now and in your materials shows the first one, the pie chart shows the just the split between urban and rural in our state based on population. So you've got about 55% of our population living in those 5 urban counties, where you've got 45% roughly living in the other 100 counties. And you would like to see a similar distribution of attorneys, right? It should look similar, but it doesn't. We've got nearly 80% of our attorneys are, got a little anxious there, are practicing in urban areas, whereas only 20% are available to serve our rural communities, right? So that really helps visualize the split within our state. And at a county by county level, this is sort of what it looks like. We've got 47 counties, which is about 45% of the counties in our state that already meet the definition of a legal desert, according to the American Bar Association definition, which is about 1 attorney per 1,000 residents. The national average, and what most people think is a healthy number of attorneys, is closer to 4 attorneys per 1,000 residents. Now, we may never get there or necessarily need that high of a level for all counties in Kansas, but we certainly need to be at a much higher level than this mapping reflects. And so you can tell from the last 2 charts that the work that we did, we're sort of able to identify what the situation looks like and quantify what things look like today. But we also wanted to look ahead a little bit to see what was going to be happening in the near future. And it was a little disconcerting. Our data and our survey information showed us that we've got a significant portion of our attorney population is approaching or has passed retirement age, right? So about 1/3 of our Kansas attorneys are over the age of 60. And that age differential is more pronounced in our rural counties, where our median age of an attorney is several years higher than what we see in those 5 other urban counties in our state. So not only is there a current shortage, but what we see is, a lot of, at least 1/3 of our population, probably higher in the rural areas, are really approaching or have passed the time where they want to retire from the profession. So just to visualize what that could look like is if we remove those attorneys from our mapping that we showed earlier, we would have 87 of our counties that would be legal deserts, 9 counties with no attorneys at all, right? So the future isn't trending in a way that looks great for us. And I do want to emphasize that this data, if anything, it does slightly understate the gravity of the situation because this mapping and the data is largely based on attorneys that have an active practice, an active license to practice law. Those are the attorneys that are available to represent clients, but not all attorneys that have an active license can do that, right? So this data includes our judges, right? District magistrate, district court judges, chief district court judges who do not represent clients in the community. It includes prosecutors, city attorneys, folks that may only represent one or a few different employers, and then they don't have capacity to represent other individuals or businesses in the community. And it includes a number of attorneys that I've seen frequently in my own judicial department in Northwest Kansas that, you know, they're not taking on new clients. They're winding down their practice, but they're just not ready to convert that active license to retired status or inactive status. They're just not ready to pull the trigger on that, but they're certainly not available to offer services to individuals in their communities. So one of the first things that I thought, and I don't think I was alone when I began to chair this committee, was, okay, there's a demand, we have a shortage of supply, so why don't we just produce more attorneys? But we quickly learned that that's really not a viable solution for several reasons. But first, I'll give you some data that shows sort of the trends over time. You can see the number of attorneys that are admitted to practice law in Kansas has sort of been on a slow decline that peaked in the mid-1990s, and a slight uptick that we don't believe is significant or will be sustainable, and I'll explain why in a minute. So the trend has been downward in terms of those that are practicing law in our state or admitted to practice in our state. Not surprisingly, we've also seen at our 2 law schools, Washburn and KU, the applications have also slowly declined to what looks to be sort of a new lower base level, and that's by application volume. And not surprisingly, when you have fewer applicants, fewer being admitted to practice law, well, you're having fewer graduating from the Kansas law schools as well. It's like the last graph, it tracks pretty closely actually a gradual decline to what seems to be a new lower baseline in terms of attorneys. So why is that happening, and what is stopping us from just increasing class sizes? According to the law school members on our committee and others law school associates that they work with, we're told that they're just receiving fewer qualified applicants anyway. There are just fewer people that are pursuing the legal profession in general. So you have fewer qualified applicants. You can't lower admission standards, right, just to get more bodies without harming accreditation or risking the law school's accreditation. So they can't just do that, and not necessarily you'd ever want them to do that. We were also told that some of these schools have made significant capital improvements or capital investments that are based on the assumption that class sizes will remain at these lower levels. And so there are physical space limitations that would prevent just simply adding more bodies in our Kansas law schools. The committee explored a variety of other options, maybe a new law school, which may be an idea that we can continue to explore, but they ultimately felt that that is a significant capital investment. There's a lot of due diligence that would have to be done to explore that possibility. And we have good, viable solutions that can start to make a dent in short order. So that became the focus of the committee. Before we kind of turn to recommendations, I always like to talk about, okay, so what there's a shortage of attorneys. Why does it matter? Insert your best lawyer joke there maybe, but it does matter. And it matters for several reasons. For one, rural attorneys are important to the economic viability of these communities. There are sophisticated business operations in rural Kansas, whether it's agricultural related, in the energy sector, oil and gas, you name it, and they need legal representation. Local attorneys oftentimes understand those business operations better because you're working with your neighbors. They understand the juries better than outside attorneys because, again, they're the neighbors. And on balance, they are not going to cost as much as trying to secure counsel from Denver or Kansas City, a larger metropolitan area, in part just because the travel time alone can significantly increase the legal expense. These attorneys are also small business employers, right? They are running a business themselves. Their law practice is a business. And many of our rural attorneys also invest in other ventures, title companies. Myself, I think of the Majestic in Scott City that was an entertainment dinner club for many years that John Shirley, a local attorney, and his wife ran. And that's just very common in these communities. Second, these attorneys also just are really important to the fabric of the community. If you look in many of our rural counties, look at who's serving on the county hospital boards, look who's on the school boards and other leading organizations, you'll see your local rural attorneys on those boards because the training and skills that they possess are well suited to that volunteer activity. And they're also helpful in working on economic development ventures and bringing grant funding into the community. But third, finally, and maybe the reason that is very unique to this profession is these rural attorneys help us fulfill our constitutional duties. And, you know, we've all in here taken that oath to uphold and defend the United States and Kansas Constitution. And these local rural attorneys are important because, as you likely know, persons charged with a felony offense have a constitutional right to counsel. And that right includes both the right to have an attorney, but also to have the court appoint counsel if you cannot afford the attorney. So that is a constitutional duty that our court system has to fulfill in many cases when the individuals cannot afford the attorney. And the legislature has expanded that right to counsel to many other case types. For example, juvenile delinquency proceedings, child in need of care proceedings, civil commitment hearings, habeas corpus proceedings, extradition proceedings, all have also a statutory right to counsel and the right to have appointed counsel at the same time. And our attorneys, our judges are struggling mightily to find those individuals to appoint to those cases. I always like to talk about child in need of care proceedings because it really helps illustrate the issue and the struggle our judges are facing. In those proceedings, they have a statutory right to independent counsel, which means that the judge may have to find an attorney to serve as guardian ad litem. They may have to find counsel for the biological mother, and separate counsel for the biological father because their interests may not and frequently are not aligned. And now, with recent legislation, if the child's position differs from the guardian ad litem, the child's entitled to independent counsel too. So you could be in a position where you're needing to find 4 different attorneys for one child in need of care proceeding. And then you can start to see visually what that looks like. This is just an example of an attorney out in Oakley, out in Logan County. Kansas that is willing to take court-appointed cases, particularly criminal cases. And so in 2023, because right now there's just a shortage of attorneys, but not all attorneys practicing in rural Kansas can or are willing to take on appointed cases. So they are in high demand, those that do. So you can see this one attorney in 1 year is handling cases all the way out in Topeka. Mind you, Shawnee County, a county that is urban under our definition, also struggling to find attorneys to fill in these roles. But all the way up to the Nebraska border in Norton County, all the way south to Oklahoma in Seward County, right? So you can see that that attorney can't be in all those locations at once. So it means that all of these courts then have to work and calendar around each other, which just slows the process of resolving these cases, right? And because of the shortage, it's really stretching our judges' abilities to fulfill that constitutional duty. Okay, so that's some of the data. And so why is this happening? We identified several barriers to recruiting and retaining attorneys in rural Kansas. There's a financial component, there's a practice component, and what we call cultural. And I'll kind of walk through and highlight each category. In terms of financial barriers, there are several issues going on, but the one that stands out the most is education debt, student loan debt. Our survey information was, I thought, produced some really revealing information. But the bottom line is we have more law students borrowing more money than ever before to get their law degree. If you looked at those that are practicing in rural Kansas prior to 1980, it was the exception that they had student loan debt. 26% of those attorneys that graduated before 1980 had any student loan debt. And those that did have student loan debt, the average was around $12,000. And I'm told if you adjust that number for inflation, that's closer to $48,000 in today's money. But those that are graduating since 2011, 93% of them have student loan debt. And their average debt load is almost $125,000, right? So that is one of the most significant changes that we've seen. And so they have to service that debt load once they graduate. And if a law firm offers a lower starting salary, or maybe offers a great opportunity, but your compensation is going to be based on your productivity, and there's uncertainty there, that's a real deterrent to recruiting new graduates from our Kansas law schools. And unfortunately, on average, the starting salary is lower and more dependent on production, you know, how much you bring into the firm in terms of compensation in our rural firms compared to our larger firms in urban areas. There's also a benefit gap that adds to it, and we have a lot of information that we've included in the materials on that. That just simply adds to and compounds that financial component for these law students. Then we also identified some what we called practice barriers, and there were several of them included under this category that we thought we could walk through. The first is the fear of isolation and the fear that there just won't be somebody available to them to help them grow professionally, to mentor them in the profession, to start out as a brand new attorney to a seasoned attorney. Most often, all practicing attorneys typically have a story about that mentor that helped them get to that point. And there's a real concern about our law students that if they go out and they take a position somewhere in a rural community, are they going to be alone on an island? Not only personally, am I going to have a peer group that I can work with, but also professionally, is there somebody there that can help develop me professionally? And you can see from our data, that makes some sense because law firms on average are smaller in our rural communities. most frequently, law firms are 1 to 3 attorneys in rural Kansas. Oftentimes, those employers don't make the best or the most natural mentors. A lot of these newer attorneys, they don't feel comfortable admitting what they don't know. Okay, but can you turn to another attorney in the community? Well, probably not, because they're probably the opposing counsel in the case that you have questions about, right? So we felt we identified a real concern about mentorship and isolation and those fears among our law students. Also, the good news is that in a smaller rural practice, you have a better opportunity to become a business owner and to do that more rapidly than you would in most urban firm settings, right? That's good news because it's a great opportunity. But a lot of our students felt like they lacked some of the business acumen to actually run the business and to handle the administration on the business side. They felt coming out of law school, they felt they had a great grasp of legal concepts, but if they were going to be in a solo practice or a small practice, you can see from our data, you're going to be spending at least 10 or maybe over 40 hours a week just working on the business side of the practice, which is not productive financially. You're not earning revenue by doing that. And a lot of our students felt ill-equipped to take on that responsibility. And finally, under this practice barrier, we found that there's a real gap in our recruiting network when it comes to rural employment. I would say that at best, it's not developed. It's probably actually non-existent. We heard so often students that maybe grew up in rural communities that would be interested in exploring these opportunities that just didn't know where to turn to identify other firms that were interested in hiring them. And then on the inverse side, so many law firms and law firm managers were saying, we don't know where to find those same students that are interested in the opportunity. So you'll see some of our recommendations are really targeted to try and resolve that gap in this recruiting network. And then there are just other misperceptions about what it means to practice in our rural communities. A lot of students felt like, well, there's not enough work out there. There may not be enough work out there for me. And is there a diverse type of practice that I can do in a rural community? And the answer is yes to both of those, because our data shows that 80% of our rural attorneys are turning away business every week, primarily because they don't have time to handle the issue, they have a conflict of interest, so they can't handle the issue, or it's an issue that they just don't practice in. It's beyond their area of expertise. But all three of those reasons support and demonstrate the need for more rural attorneys in our state. And then our survey data shows, in the next slide, that there is indeed a wide variety of legal issues available to attorneys that want to take on a rural practice. As for the third category of barriers to recruiting and retention, we call these cultural barriers. Some are larger economic issues, and others are actual myths that need to be dispelled. The larger issues, those that represent rural districts, these are not going to be surprising to you at all. We're talking about, will there be housing available for the attorney's spouse and children? We heard so frequently childcare, especially for young infants. The availability of childcare is a significant issue, especially for young families that want, with one of them or both of them interested in practicing law in a rural community. Healthcare choices, education choices, et cetera. I mean, these are larger issues our committee's not going to take on independently. We certainly want to collaborate with others that are addressing those concerns, but they are still concerns. One of the things I found most surprising, though, is a cultural myth that seemed to be prevalent, particularly among current law students that grew up in a rural community. And it was this view or the belief that success means making it in the big city, right? And if you come back and practice where you grew up or near where you grew up, somehow that meant you had failed. And we need to take steps to dispel that myth. What was more concerning to us is that we heard so frequently law students that were bucking that myth and stereotype were so often discouraged by their own mentors, either in the school or in the legal community, telling them that they would be making a mistake if they didn't accept an offer from an urban law firm over practicing in a rural community. You know, I think we need to start questioning the source of that information, because oftentimes it comes from people that have never practiced in a rural setting and don't understand the dynamics and the opportunity that exists there. On to recommendations. We have 10 recommendations. And don't worry, I'm not going to cover all 10 in great detail, but I did want to highlight a couple in particular that we found, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. The legislature has identified models that have proven to be successful in the healthcare field and in veterinary medicine practice. So our first recommendation is to work with the legislature to develop a rural attorney training program. This is a program that would be modeled after the Kansas State University Rural Vet Program. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that program, but it incorporates a curriculum that includes business development, right? It teaches them how to operate a small animal practice, right? It gives them built-in mentorship through various programs where they are being exposed to large animal practice across our state. And the benefit that the students receive is a tuition credit, right? That tuition credit comes in exchange for them committing to practice large animal veterinary practice in a rural community in our state. And the results have been astounding, really. Well over 90% of the students that have gone through that program have set up shop in a rural community, and they have remained in that same location well after their service commitment expired, right? So they're actually working in that community long enough that they're building roots in there that they don't want to uproot because they're having success with that practice and really becoming integrated into the community. The second recommendation is another one to work with the legislature to just address this student loan, student debt issue head on. And this is a model that is patterned after the KU Med Center's rural physician loan programs, which were created by the legislature and continued to be supported by the legislature. And again, this is a loan repayment incentive to a student or a current attorney in exchange for a commitment to practice in a rural area of our state, much like the KU Med's rural physician program does as well, and has realized similar success in their endeavors, right? And so those two, what we found, even in talking to law students, that the biggest barrier to them is, the lack of business skills, but really it's the debt load that they're carrying. And if we had a program like this available, our focus group interviews suggested that we would have significantly higher number of our graduating law students practicing in rural communities. So we have good data that suggests that these programs would be successful. A third recommendation I just wanted to mention, because it took off organically and it kind of outpaced the work of the committee itself, was the development of a rural attorney network that would address, like I said, that recruiting network that just doesn't exist now, that matches rural employers with law students that want to and are willing to explore those opportunities. And thanks to the Patterson Family Foundation, they've provided a grant to Washburn Law to help develop that network with a full-time staff person that will be dedicated to the network's creation. At the same time, that money will be used to expand what the Dane Hansen Foundation has already done in Northwest Kansas, which is to provide paid internship opportunities to law students over the summer in any rural community in our state. That started at Washburn Law with funding from the Dane Hansen Foundation. These law students could go out and do legal work in a rural community in their catchment area, which was Northwest Kansas. And now with this additional grant funding, that program's going to be expanded statewide. And it makes a significant difference. If you can get a law student into the community for the summer doing legal work, they can really see what that experience will be like, what opportunities exist. In fact, we have committee members on the Rural Justice Initiative that came from that program, and they continue to practice in rural parts of our state. We have several other recommendations. Some of them are aimed at just targeting younger folks in our state, making them familiar with the judiciary through civics education and employment opportunities that exist within them, just to get more interest in legal practice in general and the law-related jobs that are out there and in high demand by employers, just to get our younger folks thinking about it. Because what we learned from the data is that children are starting to form thoughts about who they want to be professionally or in terms of employment at very young ages. It was surprising to me that, middle school, even some elementary school, they're starting to really shape those views of themselves. And we need to start reaching out to people of all ages across our state to make them know about the opportunities that exist here. Other programs are designed to give practice support, or other recommendations, I should say, I apologize, are designed to give practice support to those that are practicing in rural parts of our state, to make them aware of programs that may already exist in our state, but we just don't know about them as much, or they're not as highly promoted in the legal profession. But there are long-term strategies and short-term strategies. But the few that I've identified, the first two identified, really have a proven track record. And it's a way that we can all work together, collaborate with the legislature to make a real impact on what we think this is going to be a serious problem throughout our state in the near future. I do want to save some time for the Chief Justice as well, but I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Okay, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Committee, what questions? Who has a question? Anybody? Representative Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. It was really insightful. My question is on our law school graduates. Do we have any idea like how many of those are in-state and out-of-state students? I tend to think that more in-state students would tend to stay here and practice, be more likely to. So I was just curious about that.
That's a great question, and I don't have the answer to your specific question, but what I do know is that the most recent graduating class that we have data on, just over 50% of those students left our state. So I'm assuming there's a correlation to whether those students were out of state. But we think that actually that's an area where we can make improvements if we can start to retain some of those that we are losing from graduation from our state.
I could just follow up with that. That is the same information and response that I got from the School of Veterinary Medicine as well, because so I think we have to work with our universities that if we are wanting to have students that are going to stay here, we have to make more of a concentrated effort that we're recruiting students from Kansas to our schools.
I agree, Representative. I think that's a great idea, and that's why I think our recommendations are both designed to let our students know from early ages on about the opportunity to practice law in our state, and then to work with the law schools to, we need to be bringing these folks into the fold and finding a way to keep them in our state.
Representative Schreiber.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Justice Wall. I may have missed it, but the graph that shows the number of attorneys admitted in Kansas shows a sharp uptick, and I think you made the statement that you didn't think that was going to continue. I didn't catch maybe the reason why.
Yeah, from what I've heard is that there was a short-term spike around the pandemic for whatever reason. And most folks that I've talked to in the law school just believe that now that that pandemic has resolved, that they're not going to see that as a long-term trajectory, coupled with the fact that, you know, in our state, at least we have a new law school for one of our institutions, and I think it was built with a certain class size in mind that doesn't reflect the kind of sizes when I graduated law school, which was nearly twice as many, not quite twice as many, but close to twice as many students. Yeah.
Representative Osman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And thank you, Justice, for your insightful presentation. Actually, when I heard the State of the Judiciary from the Chief Justice, I had a number of questions as it relates to cause and effect, and I think that they've all been answered through this presentation. The question that remains is, where do we go from here? You've got recommendations, but as it relates to the legislature in particular, how do you see this manifesting? Is it, will there be legislation forthcoming or a bill forthcoming? Is this a pilot program through appropriation? Do you see something else entirely for how we can assist?
Yes, thank you for that question. And we have drafted proposed legislation for those first two recommendations. We have been working with the reviser and expect that legislation to be introduced this session. So that would be the most direct and immediate way that we think we can work with the legislature on those initiatives. I might defer to the Chief Justice, who may have more specifics about how, when that might be introduced this session. Yep. Thank you.
Representative Goddard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It appears that the study really concentrated on homegrown attorneys out of KU, et cetera. I seem to remember that there was an initiative to increase the compensation of court-appointed attorneys with the idea that it might attract attorneys from out of state. Did the study consider how we attract attorneys from another state to come to Kansas?
Yeah, that was certainly part of the work that the committee considered. We struggled to find data that would identify a reliable figure at what that rate might be to encourage folks to come into our state. But we have been intentional on our second recommendation, the one that addresses student loan incentives for these law students, to not limit it. So if you are a practicing attorney in another state, willing and interested to practice in rural Kansas, that could still be a benefit available to you. And we have anecdotal information. I know that, like, the Finney County attorney out in Garden City has successfully recruited newer attorneys from Oklahoma, at least to serve during internship programs, partly because the compensation, as I understand it, for county attorneys is slightly higher in our state than in Oklahoma. So those with an interest there, you know, that pay gap or benefit in the state of Kansas is at least luring people to explore that possibility. It's so early on, I don't have any good data on you know, how many folks that has drawn into our state.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Justice Wall, for an enlightening and distressing presentation. Real first question is, these slides are outstanding. Is there a written report that was prepared by the committee?
There
and
is.
If so, where would it be found?
Thank you. Thank you. I believe the report was sent by separate email or cover letter to all members of the committee. And it is also on our website. And I believe the last slide gives you the link to find that final report
Very good.
on our judicial branch website.
I'm distressed to cause the court to think I did not immediately read or pay attention to your email, but I no longer hold active status, so there you go. I do have a substantive question, though. I've watched with interest the medical profession's attempts to deal with a similar circumstance with some similar approaches to financially incentivize practices in rural Kansas. I've also watched, though, a trend toward trying to fill the doctor gap, if you will, with mid-level practitioners. I don't advocate for that in the medical profession nor in the legal profession, at least as ultimate responsibility for patient or client outcomes. Did the committee look at that possibility? What, if any, conclusions were drawn, understanding that I'm not a strong advocate for placing mid-levels in ultimate decision-making authority?
Yes, thank you for that question. It is an issue that the committee explored in some detail, and what we're talking about, for those that may not be as familiar, is letting non-licensed attorneys engage in a limited set of practices of law, even though they haven't gone to law school, passed the bar, either through certification or some sort of testing program. Some states have adopted that sort of limited licensure for non-attorneys to be authorized to practice in certain areas of the law, with very mixed results, and some too soon to tell. So our committee was concerned about some of the adverse reports that came from some of the states that implemented this program. And others, like Colorado, just started the program, I believe, this year, so it's too early to tell. Our committee was very committed to actually getting licensed attorneys in these communities because they just bring so many different advantages that we can't get through that limited licensure. But to continue to study how this is working in other states in terms of providing access to justice.
Representative Lewis.
Thank you, Justice Wall, for the very informative presentation. And I'm from Garden City, and I can attest that the picture you paint is an accurate one. We have too few lawyers, and many of them are over 60. And I know several that continue to practice, not necessarily because they want to, but because they feel it's a service to the community. So we're in dire need of new young lawyers. And I've also seen that several young lawyers come to town and then they get poached by Wichita firms. That happened not too long ago. But I want to address another issue which is related, and it doesn't have so much to do with the rural versus urban divide, but just the number of lawyers we have in the profession. I've been practicing for 37 years, and lawyering is a very difficult profession. There's a lot of stress involved. If you litigate, you have conflict with your, the courts, conflict with your adversaries, conflict with your client potentially. There's a lot of conflict and stress involved in practicing law. And what I've observed is that so many people who go to law school end up not practicing. In my own case, I noticed that by the 5th year reunion at my law school, there were, I would say 50% of the class were no longer practicing law. And I'm wondering to what extent you probably didn't, but my question is, how can we keep individuals that we've trained in the law practicing law? And that would help not only the rural communities, but all across the board.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and maybe a little beyond the scope of what we focused on. But I do think that you see a greater emphasis in our profession about, just not, I don't want to say work-life balance, but how to manage that stress in a productive way. So in a way, offering services to attorneys where they can work through that in a way that they're not holding resentment towards the profession itself. I think that's one area that the Office of Judicial Administration is focused on, and providing that service to our current attorneys. Of course, there are practice areas that don't have to be as adversarial, estate planning, for example, which is, as you know, there's a great demand for that too in our rural communities. And just letting folks know that, hey, there are other options. There's mediation. There's ways to resolve that conflict too. And I think part of our outreach, I think you've raised a good issue that we need to consider as part of folding that into our outreach efforts, whether it's to younger folks or to existing attorneys.
Just one
Go ahead.
follow-up, but just, I meant to mention this, but in Garden City, we've had a problem with attorney suicides in recent years. I mean, it's gotten to that level, and the causes for that are many and varied, but I think that's just a concern that we have to deal with if we're talking about lawyers and the numbers that continue to practice.
I agree. I think that's an excellent point. And, you've seen the KLAP, the Kansas Legal Assistance Programs, how they've really grown and evolved and tried to be responsive because of situations like that.
Sorry, Representative Barth.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Justice Wall and Chief Justice Lukert for being here today. Just another kind of idea. Appreciate the information you've shared, but I know universities are expensive. Not only have I graduated from university, I have 2 daughters in college right now myself, and there's a lot of class requirements that don't really fit into the degree that they're going for. Is there any reform available within universities and flexibilities to reduce, I don't know what to call it, not mean to be inappropriate, but unnecessary for being an attorney? Maybe filling that with some requirements of business classes instead of taking modern dance or something like that, which I did take in college because I had to have one of those classes. Is there anything we can do there which would help address college is expensive, but help reduce the cost because you're taking classes that really will fit the job description down the road? Thank you.
Excellent question, Representative. I think one of our recommendations is to convert what was an ad hoc committee into a standing committee, because we understand that we need to continue to explore so many of these issues and some of the issues you guys have raised today, including ways to make education more affordable, right? And so we're meeting with law school deans, but I don't think it can stop there. That's something that we're going to need to explore, but I don't have an answer for you today. I think it's an excellent point. The cost of education, there's no doubt, has substantially increased. And I'll be in your situation next year. I only have 1 in college, but I'll have 2 next year. Yeah. Thank you.
And thank you, Justice. But I might be mistaken, but isn't there a program at KU where you, instead of 4 years of undergraduate and then 3 years of law school, it is short. There is a program now where you can do it in 6 years. Is that right?
That is correct.
Mhm.
Thanks for
So-
pointing that out.
Mhm.
And it is available at both of our law
Okay.
schools, in fact, where you can participate in an accelerated program where you do 3 years of undergraduate coupled with the 3 years of law school. So you're graduating in 6 rather than 7 years. So there are many undergraduate institutions across the state of Kansas that are participating in that program for both law schools. So that is one option or avenue that has developed. And thank you, Madam Chairman, for reminding me of that. But we're confident that there can be others as well as we continue to study.
Okay, committee, any other questions? I have a couple questions. I'm mostly interested in kind of the boots on the ground recommendations. 1 and 2 would be, you said there might be bills drafted. Would you say that's mostly appropriations? Is that sort of the idea? Okay. And
Yes.
then the third one sounds like maybe there's some grant money and that kind of thing.
That's correct.
Several of them towards the end, the Supreme Court should support civics education, encourage pre-law programming, support opportunities, encourage rural attorneys. What does the Supreme Court do? Like, what does that look like, those kind of recommendations, 6 through 10? What
Right.
would you be doing?
Well, I think one of the concepts is the idea of adding a learning center at the Judicial Center that would provide a curriculum that would also be available to all school districts across the state to promote that civics education. And I would defer to Chief, who probably knows the details of that more specifically. It can be some of our staff within the Office of Judicial Administration working with other legal organizations, Kansas Bar Association, Kansas Women Attorneys Association, to develop practice forms that help simplify and educate newer attorneys on various areas of rural practice. There's really not a single repository where that can happen. Some of the things that we currently do with the Supreme Court's travel docket, where we try and travel to communities across our state to show the community what an argument looks like at the Kansas Supreme Court, sort of like we'll be doing tomorrow night, which I hope some of you, if not all of you, are able to attend, to just expose folks to the legal practice. That's some of the ideas that we have in mind, and there are many others, but we didn't want to be too precise or limited because we want to also be flexible enough to look at maybe local models that are working where we can step in and support that. Maybe we can scale it up to statewide, but those are a few of the examples.
Thank you. Yeah, great ideas. All right, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here, Justice Wall. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And now if Chief Justice Lukert, if you could come up and give us some, I don't know if it's closing arguments, closing comments, but yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you for being here.
Certainly, Madam Chair. Thank you again, Chief Justice Marla Lukert. It's my pleasure to be here today. To follow up on just a few of the lingering questions from this exchange, we have received, just before I came in here, I was told we now have numbers for the legislation. So we think there's a good chance that the 2 bills will be introduced this week even. So that is starting. I think Justice Wall did cover most of what I would answer in terms of the chair's last question. We have asked for, and you have given us as a legislature, money to explore the development of a learning center across the street. This would be a repurposing of what used to be a library space that nobody needs anymore for a hands-on civics education center that would cover all 3 branches of government, really, would be available for students as they come through. But the idea would be when you develop that staff working with certified teachers, because we do want it to be very educational oriented, that we would be working with them and their colleagues across the state to develop curriculum that could be used in the schools across at all levels, in particular those grade levels where they are focused on that have as part of their curriculum certain objectives for civics education, but also broader than that, and work with different at all levels from small to older. Because as Justice Wall has indicated, the research tells us the earlier we talk to students about potential career opportunities, that's very formative. And so we need to be talking to them, not talking to them, that's not the way we want to talk about that. We want to be talking with them about their career options, even at very young ages. So those are the ideas with that, and we've moved now past, we have used the money you gave us last session to work with an architect. We now have architectural renderings for that, and a cost estimates. So that is a part of our budget request this year, would be to fund that learning center, that capital improvement across the street to develop that. So we are excited about that prospect now, and would be something that obviously will continue to grow in the future in terms of what we can do with that. We, as both appellate courts in particular, but also working with our district courts, encourage a lot of outreach to students already. The Supreme Court travels twice a year. When we do that, we usually do oral arguments at night, similar to what we'll be doing with you tomorrow, and inviting you to the old Supreme Court chamber on the 3rd floor at 5:30 tomorrow evening for an argument in one case. We do that in communities. This last year, we were in Lansing and Lewisburg. It was our L year, I guess. We will, in a few weeks, be continuing our L series, and we will be at the Logan Life Center, Logan County. It is an interesting facility that has both school, care facility, community center, all in one large campus environment. And we're flipping what we usually do. When we usually do the oral argument at night, the justices spend the day fanning out to high schools and middle schools and junior colleges. And usually we hit over 1,000 students on a trip. We are doing it the other way, and we're inviting the students to us, working with the Dane Hansen Foundation and their network. They're helping to make that doable for schools, to bring in high school students to hear our oral argument. Then the justices are going to fan out to the communities and have open houses with and meetings, meet and greets types of things around the community so that people can come and ask us questions in that way. The Court of Appeals does the same thing. They always are traveling, and so they hit a lot more communities. Last year, they were in Kansas City, Hayes, Osage City, Colby, Oakley, and Lawrence. And so they do a great job of helping us reach those students. But this certainly looking to the future is what we need to do. Not only do we have a shortage of attorneys, we have a shortage of people to do our other roles in the court system. Particularly acute are court reporters. We are down to the point where we have many judicial districts that do not have a court reporter at all in the district. We are doing and working on some innovative things to help solve that problem, including just recently in the last few weeks, we have converted a position to a statewide court reporter position. We have an employee who is willing to travel, and so that person will be covering around the state and helping us to fill that need. We have increasingly been using transcriptionists and recordings and transcriptionists and repurposing those court reporter positions that we can't fill to do two things. One, to create those transcriptionist positions, and secondly, to create somebody in the courtroom to help manage that for the judge. When you have a court reporter, the attorneys can tell you one of the things that a court reporter does is make sure you get a good record. So that court reporter can interrupt Representative Carmichael if he's in trial and say, I'm sorry, there are 5 people talking. I can't take you all at once. Could you please only have one person talking? Or maybe even just you were mumbling. I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you repeat what you said? They do those kinds of things to make sure that when that record gets up to appeal for review, we have a record that we can depend on. And so we are repurposing positions to do that type of thing. But we are also asking in our budget for more of that, and also for the next step of that, a digital evidence situation, because attorneys are not wanting to be in courtroom A and have one system they have to learn how to present digital evidence, and in courtroom B, maybe in the neighboring county, and it's a totally different system. And so those are a couple of core types of things that we are doing. So, I want to be sure to answer questions if you have them. If not, I have a few other things that I could mention as updates or things to look forward to in this next year. Things some updates and some initiatives I didn't talk about in my speech the other day. But
Okay.
I do want to give you time for questions.
We could pause maybe for, does anyone have any questions for Chief Justice Lukert? Okay, please give us some updates.
Okay.
That sounds great.
Well, one of the things that I wanted to tell you about was give you a little bit, well, I mentioned specialty courts, but give you a little bit more detail. I think I kind of promised that in my speech. So we are at a point now where we have seen continued and steady growth. So we are up to 32 specialty courts that are operating in 19 judicial districts. They're serving 25 counties. And so those include drug and addiction courts, mental health courts, veterans courts, youth courts. And then, as I said, it's not truly a specialty or the same exact model, but we have added the 3 new pilot projects in our family treatment courts. So those are what we are doing. We expect to bring 2 more into the system fairly soon. Lawrence is going to start a veterans treatment court very soon, and then Salina is starting a behavioral health court. We continue to work with Senator Moran for federal funding for our veterans treatment courts. We were able to build those courts at a more rapid pace because of his position in Congress and his support of those courts. So that has helped us build those. As I mentioned, we have had the specialty funding committee that includes legislators, 4 legislators that serve on that. That committee has recommended that we ask you for $3 million to add stability to the funding for those courts that are existing and to also allow us to grow courts. Counties fund right now, those are basically county funded or grant funded, or a combination of the 2. We have some counties who just cannot afford to fund those courts. And so especially, again, it's really a rural urban gap in that way often. But also we have courts who depend upon funding. They have a grant year after year after year, and then all of a sudden the grant's gone. And so we do have unstable funding for those courts, and we would like to stabilize that. You heard Nancy Strauss mention to you the introduction of bills, Uniform Law Commission bills on guardianships, kind of in part knowing that that was a possibility, as there's just a general movement across the country to update guardianship and conservatorship statutes, and also to increase the oversight of guardianships and conservatorships. There are several states that have seen incredible abuse. It's very sad and tragic situations. Kansas has had some of that, but maybe not to the extent of some other states. But it's in large response to that courts are moving forward in trying to be more proactive and in monitoring those guardianship and conservatorship situations. So we have received a $683,000 federal grant that is will cover over 3 years for us to help to build programs that will allow more monitoring. We're working with the Department of, we're working with the Kansas Department for Children and Families, their Adult Protective Services area, and also the Kansas Guardianship Program. The other part of this will be to really help recruit guardians and conservators, another area where we just lack people with the professional expertise and training to be able to do that in a way in which we feel safe and secure for the person that whose assets is the focus of the conservatorship, or whose person is the focus of the guardianship. So we are really working to beef that up. Those of you who have been in the legislature for a while may have heard us talk about our mental health summit that we did a couple of years ago. That summit is much like I described with the child welfare summit that I spoke about in my speech to the joint session. What we have done in each of those situations is within our judicial districts, created multidisciplinary teams that are focused on whatever that issue is, the child in need of care or mental illness. So when we have individuals who are justice involved that have a mental illness issue, we are dealing with therapy, therapists, mental health, community, county mental health. Oftentimes we are dealing with pastors and physicians and many others who are dealing with those individuals who may become justice involved. We have created multidisciplinary teams in each of those districts that are looking at what are the services we are providing, where are the gaps, and how do we fill those gaps. And they're coming up with some very innovative ways to do that. And we are going to circle back around to provide some additional education, best practice advice, some national speakers to help with that. For the Mental Health Summit, it will be in August on the Fort Hays campus, hoping again to make that accessible to our rural communities. So that is something that we are looking forward to. I'm very cognizant of the time. I could keep going. There are many exciting things that we are doing to try to help in your communities, and to be sure that we are providing access to justice in fair and impartial ways to all of our citizens. So again, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to stand and understand time's up.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if people have questions, we'd love to hear more from you. Committee, do you have any questions? And if you have just, something that you really feel like we need to know.
I think we've covered.
You're good, okay.
Certainly, if questions come up at any time,
Mhm.
I'm available to any of you. Please just reach out. I think hopefully you know Marisa and Marisa Bayless, Cheryl Simmel, and see them around, and we'll be happy to get information to you on any topic that we can about the court system and how it operates. I know some of you are new to this committee. If you'd like to meet with us and just have us explain how the court structure works, how funding works, because it's a very confusing system. Some things are paid by the county, some things are paid by the state. We would be glad to spend the time with you to help you understand how all of that works the best we can. And then I will invite you to join us tomorrow evening at 5:30. There will be a reception following. We will be hearing the argument, as I said, in what used to be the Supreme Court courtroom before they built the Judicial Center across the street. But after that, the reception will be in front of the State Law Library, and we welcome the opportunity to visit there and answer questions that you might have.
Do you have any idea how long you'll be? I mean, what time the reception might be for those of us who might need to slip in or out?
The arguments are scheduled to be 15 minutes aside. I don't necessarily control how many questions my colleagues may have.
Oh, I know how you feel.
But I really do think by 6 or 6:15, we will be out of the courtroom and across the way and ready to meet you. There.
Thank you. We really appreciate your accessibility and your willingness to come and visit with us and meet. So thank you so much for that and everything that you do. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for your service. And again, we're available for any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, committee, just two last things. One is Lene, our committee assistant, nobody wanted paper. So those of you who weren't here, if you would like the testimony, you're always going to get an agenda, a paper agenda on your desk. But if you would like the testimony printed and in one of the folders and ready for you with the bills that we're going to be hearing, please let her know today, okay? Let her know today before you leave. Okay, the other thing is we are not going to meet tomorrow, committee. We don't really have, the only thing on the agenda would have been bill introductions, and we don't, that can wait till Thursday. We do have 2 presentations on Thursday from 2 different organizations, so we'll be doing that. Shouldn't take, that won't be a late evening. We don't have bills to hear yet, so just enjoy it right now because I think it's going to get busy, but enjoy your time off tomorrow. So, okay, thank you. We're adjourned.